In this special series of Afternoon Light, you'll hear from participants in our Menzies Early Career Network, a program for university students to learn, research, publish on a topic of Australian contemporary history and liberal thought. The students' essays will be published in a new book, Menzies Rediscovered, a new generation's inspiration for political philosophy, domestic challenges and foreign affairs, in March 2026. Well, today I'm joined by Andrew Fankhauser, who has written an essay on Konfrontasi and evolving defence policy. And Andrew is a current student at Monash University, where he's studying law and international relations. So welcome to the Afternoon Light podcast and this special series on the Menzies Early Career Network participants' work.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Andrew, so you participated in MECN, as we call it, rolls off the tongue, the Early Career Network program this year in 2025. Yes. And you've obviously got an interest in international relations and defence policy.
Yep.
What made you want to participate in this sort of program?
Well, I attended the Anzac oration from the Robert Menzies Institute earlier this year, and you mentioned the program to me, and I thought, well, I've got quite an interest in history, particularly Australian history in the mid-20th century, so I thought, yeah, this might be a good thing to do, particularly given I'm fairly early in my undergraduate studies still. I'm second year, so having the opportunity to have a published work this early was, I thought, quite a good opportunity.
Yeah, fantastic. And what have you gotten out of the experience, Andrew?
Well, I've certainly been able to hone my research skills, which has been something I've been quite happy to do.
Yep.
And also just learning a lot more about Menzies and the period that I'm interested in.
Yeah, fantastic. And you chose the topic of Konfrontasi, which is probably not a military conflict that a lot of Australians know about.
Yeah, it's fairly niche.
Tell me what attracted you to this topic.
Well, again, in the Anzac oration, I heard Peter Cosgrove speak very briefly about Konfrontasi. You mentioned it, and I thought, hang on, I've heard that term before, because it wasn't something I was completely familiar with.
No.
Because I've had an interest in the history of the SAS, partly, and that spoke about some of their early operations in Borneo. And so I sort of thought, hang on, what's that? I know that term, and thought, yes, that might be something good to connect with the latter part of Menzies' tenure as Prime Minister and see how he managed things during that period.
Yeah. And so why do you think Australians don't know very much about Konfrontasi? Because it would have been at the time in the early 60s a major concern for Australians.
It was quite important, and it was spoken about, but not Australia's involvement in it. So there was a lot of talk about what Indonesia was doing to Malaysia and the whole situation over there, but Australia's involvement in it militarily was kept quite quiet.
Yeah, sort of downplayed, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it, partly because some of the stuff they were doing was very, very sensitive, so they couldn't necessarily talk about it because it would have damaged a lot of relations with various people. But I think that's mainly why not many people know about it. And also because it was right at the start of Vietnam, so that was sort of beginning to overshadow things, or at least in the long term, looking back, it's Vietnam overshadows Konfrontasi.
Yeah.
And also it was just after the Malayan emergency, which if you have, I suppose, some level of military history knowledge in Australia, you might have heard of the Malayan emergency, not necessarily know what it is, but you've heard of it, but it was sort of right in between there and you just don't necessarily know about it.
So this is in a time of decolonisation, the end of the British Empire and an end of other European empires throughout, and that, of course, affects our region in Southeast Asia. Can you explain what was Konfrontasi? It's an Indonesian word.
Yes. So Konfrontasi essentially means a period of confrontation, if you like. And so Indonesia basically didn't want Malaysia to exist because they thought it to be a threat to their I suppose, freedom to do what they wished, because they felt it to be a sort of neo-colonial British project proximate to them, and they thought that posed a risk to their interests. Yeah. And so they launched Konfrontasi, as they called it.
Yeah. And so Malaya had been part of the British Empire?
Yes, yes.
And so as the British Empire ends, this is when the the state of Malaysia is created. I mean, what was it about Malaysia particularly? Was it that troubled the Indonesians? Was it that it was going to still have that alignment with Britain? Or?
Essentially, yeah. They thought it a threat to their regional ambitions because the leader, Sukarno, wasn't a communist, but he was sympathetic to the Indonesian Communist Party. And they felt that having a Western-aligned country so close to them was a threat to potentially their ambitions, regional or internal.
And in terms of Australia's interests, so, I mean, Australia was supporting Malaysia's position here. Why did we?
Well, it was essentially the reasons Indonesia didn't want it was the reasons Australia wanted it.
So our interests did not align.
Yes. They felt it was sort of a stabilising pro-Western state in the region, which obviously is a good thing if you're a Western-aligned state. So they felt it in their interest to ensure that remained. Yeah.
So what was the approach that Australia took in Konfrontasi then?
Well, they were initially quite hesitant to be involved militarily, so it was primarily managed diplomatically until quite far into it. Australia wanted to manage it quite carefully, so they had to balance, I guess, Indonesia's relations because it's so proximate and they shared a border with the territory of New Guinea, so they had to manage that and make sure Indonesia didn't become too aggressive towards Australia itself. But they also had to make sure that Malaysia remained. And so they had to sort of strike a careful balance between the two and also maintain a good relationship with Britain because, I mean, that was sort of a given, but they didn't want to annoy them too much either.
Yeah. I mean, Australia's approach was a firm but friendly response. It didn't end up going all in to defend Malaysia with troops on the ground, but it didn't want to appease Indonesia and allow Indonesia to sort of overwhelm Malaysia's ambitions to be an independent sovereign state. So, I mean, was it possible for such a compromised position to succeed, do you think, Andrew?
Well, just on that term, firm but friendly, I acquired that term from a secondary source that I read somewhere or other, and I thought it really described Australia's approach quite well in terms of that balance. And so it's hard to say whether that position would succeed had the confrontation continued, because obviously it ended and relations with Indonesia sort of gradually fixed themselves. So, yes, it's hard to say whether or not, had the Konfrontasi continued, it would have succeeded, because I'm inclined to think that eventually Menzies, or perhaps not Menzies, Holt, would have had to go all in one way or the other. And I'm inclined to think that it would have been on defending Malaysia rather than appeasing Indonesia, even though that would have risked potentially a greater conflict and war with Indonesia. I think in the global political world that we're in, it's better to have continued alliances with people that you know are going to be your friends into the future rather than just appeasing someone who's a potential enemy in Indonesia. So I'm inclined to think that had it continued, we would have eventually had to go all in one way or the other, but that didn't happen, so it's hard to say exactly what we would have done in that circumstance.
How did it end up being resolved, Andrew?
Well, it was resolved internally. So Sukarno, who was the president of Indonesia, was overthrown. Once that happened, it sort of all fizzled out. Konfrontasi ended and it sort of stopped fairly abruptly. And, everything sort of fixed itself.
And, of course, this then dealt with some of the concerns around communism in Indonesia with the elevation of Suharto to the presidency.
That's it, yes.
Yeah. What about the role of secret intelligence in calibrating the Menzies government's response during that time, Andrew? Was that important?
Well, in my essay, I did write a little bit about that, about secret intelligence. It's hard to say exactly how important that was, but it certainly was there. I got my information in respect of ASIO from the official history, and that did mention about how ASIO would monitor the Indonesian embassy and officials in Australia. And that was quite interesting because that did tell Menzies that Indonesia now regarded Australia as an enemy, even if it wasn't necessarily like that in practice. That's how they viewed us. So I'm sure that informed the approach somewhat. And there were elements of ASIS in Indonesia who were informing the government about troop movements and, I suppose, the internal feelings towards Sukarno and the regime over there. So I'm sure that helped calibrate both the military and diplomatic response to the incident.
Do you think that our responses to previous conflicts helped inform how we dealt with Konfrontasi? We'd had the Malayan emergency,
certainly,
for example.
From a military perspective, certainly it helped introduce Australia to the region. Well, specifically that part of the region, because World War II, whilst still informing the approach perhaps in terms of diplomatic means, was still a little bit ago. It was 20 years previous. So militarily, certainly Malaya helped inform the approach as well as in a political sense as well.
I guess we learned the importance of deterrence over overt aggression.
Yes.
Deterrence obviously was the preferred
Absolutely.
approach. And what about the impact that Konfrontasi, building on the Malayan emergency and of course the Korean War before that, what about the impact it had on our defensive planning going forward?
Well, I argue that it helped to entrench the concept of forward defence, which isn't perhaps a conventional argument in this space. In fact, I've read the opposite. And I felt that it helped to further how Australia would involve itself in the region, but not right close to us in terms of defending us, but sort of confronting threats that would affect the whole region. So it's a rather strange way of interpreting forward defence, but I think that it aligns that way and helped inform our approach to Vietnam as well.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for the essay you've researched, you've written, and will be published in 2026. It's a great essay, a great contribution to the historiography around this very important Cold War military confrontation that Australia was involved in. And I congratulate you on your work.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.